Kevin OWOCKI, nice to meet you, man. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good, thanks. I've been relegated to outside my outdoor office today because they're doing construction inside of my house. So thanks for bearing with me if you hear any wind chimes in the background.
Getting pretty cold here in Argentina, so I wish I could have an outside office. Man, researching for this project, by the way, shout out to Trevor for organizing this.
Yeah,
researching
totally.
for this project, I just like got deep into the rabbit hole of watching all the Quadratic Lands videos that you've put out. Like the branding is pretty awesome. The videos are really trippy, man.
Yeah, thanks. So the Quadratic Lands is the promised land where everything's quadratic funded and there's plenty of public goods and digital democracy. And it's been fun to create that universe for people.
And yeah, for people that don't know you, Kevin OWOCKI, like you are pretty much the man behind Quadratic Lands,
Sure.
Gitcoin. And would you like to give people a quick rundown of what both of these are?
Yeah, totally. We should probably start there. So I'm the founder of Gitcoin, which is a place that you can get coins if you are a software developer working on open source software. We think that open source software is such a beautiful thing for the world. $500 billion per year in economic value is created by open source. Every time I start a new web project, I don't create my own database server. I don't create my own web server. I just fork Apache and Postgres, and I use those. And I'm standing on the shoulders of giants running Gitcoin off of open source. And our mission is to make sure that open source software developers are well funded. And one of the reasons why that's a problem is that open source software is available online for free and anyone can copy the code for free. So why would you pay for it? And as a result, you see these open source maintainers that don't have a lot of opportunity to monetize their work. And so they work at Google or like Chase Bank during the day, and then they contribute to open source nights and weekends for free, basically away from their family. And we think that's effed up. And we want to build business models into open source software so that people can get paid for working on open source software. And one of the things that we're trying to do is like, that's the idea behind the Quadratic Lands. The Quadratic Lands is this promised land where if you work on public goods, if you work on open source software, you can get paid just for working on our digital infrastructure. And we're trying to meme it into existence with lots of rainbows and shiny colors and unicorns, which if your audience goes to quadraticlands.com, you will see plenty of shiny objects, I'm sure. So it's been a lot of fun. So far, Gitcoin has done $20 million worth of funding for open source software.
Right. Would you like to just speak a bit more about the Quadratic Lands project and how it's driving Gitcoin into a decentralized model?
Totally. Yeah. So basically, Quadratic Lands is named after quadratic funding, which is one of the mechanisms through which we fund open source software. If you allow me to share my screen really quick, I can just show you how that works. I'm not sure if the video will come through to all subscribers, though. Maybe I should just speak to it.
Definitely share.
Yeah, okay, cool. So basically, quadratic funding is part of the social contract behind Gitcoin. And we built this little website.
By the way, I love this website. What the fuck is quadratic funding? Love it.
Yeah. Ooh, I can curse on your podcast. I just learned. That's exciting.
People have done it before. No one cares.
Okay. So basically, quadratic funding is this idea by Vitalik Buterin, who's the founder of Ethereum, Zoe Hitzig, and Glenn Weil from the Radical Exchange movement. And they made this really beautiful paper about the economics, about the mathematically optimal way to fund public goods. Public goods are just things that we consume for free, like open source software or clean air. And since they're available for free, it's hard to build business models for them, despite their importance. And so basically, there's this economic paper, and we built this like flashy website because who's got time to read a 40-page paper about quadratic funding? And so basically, I'm going to explain to you real quick what quadratic funding is and why it's such a powerful way of funding public goods. And I'm going to use this calculator that we built in order to do that. So basically, it's a way of distributing a matching pool of funds to a group of projects in a community that are supporting public goods. And the way that it works is that if you're deploying the matching amount contemporaneously at the same time as a crowdfunding campaign, and the matching pool gets distributed. If two projects raise the same amount of money, the one that had the broader base of support is going to be the one that's funded by the mechanism. And what's really powerful about this is that you're optimizing for the projects that a community really cares about, the poor and the many of a community really care about, as opposed to the rich of the few. But what's really powerful about it is that you'll contribute to open source software and you'll get a match from the matching pool for every single granular donation. And that's really exciting because it gives you an incentive to get over that free rider problem of why should I bother to contribute to this open source project? A $10 donation can be met with $200 worth of matching, depending on how broadly supported a project is. And so that's the idea behind quadratic funding. And you can go to WTFisQF.com if you want to play with your own math there. Quadratic funding is the basis of Gitcoin and how we fund open source software. We funded almost $20 million worth of open source with quadratic funding. So I'm mindful that you asked me about the quadratic lands, but I felt like I had to explain quadratic funding as a prerequisite to the quadratic lands.
that was a great quick explanation on quadratic funding. Let me just quickly send to a message from the sponsor, and then you can talk about quadratic lands. In the meantime, guys, if you're watching this ad, why don't you take the time to hit subscribe, hit the like button, leave a comment, check out. Remember to write down that you're going to learn more about Gitcoin after watching this video. So yeah, we'll be right back. The Blockchain People podcast is brought to you by Coin Payments, the world's first and leading crypto payment processor. Coin Payments serves over 70,000 merchants in over 200 nations with industry-low fees since 2013. The Coin Payments wallet lets users hold over 2,000 different cryptocurrencies, which is why they're used by giants such as NordVPN and Binance. Whether you're a merchant or an individual looking to get paid in crypto, Coin Payments could be just what you need.
So the quadratic lands is basically like, imagine a world in which quadratic funding is built at scale. So basically right now we're doing $20 million worth of funding of open source on Gitcoin. And I'm really proud of that number. It's in the millions, which feels big to me, but $500 billion per year in economic value is created by open source. So that's like 10x, 100x, 1000x, like 10,000x from here that we could grow and support open source software developers. And that's just one category of public goods. Like think about journalism and countering misinformation. Think about clean air. Think about clean water. Think about transportation networks. There's so many public goods in the world that are just really important. Digital privacy, I think, is a public good. And making sure that people that are working on them as well are well funded at scale is the kind of civilization that I want to live in. And that's the quadratic lands. It's a world in which the preferences of the poor and the many, of the everyday citizens, not just the rich people, are expressed in what's funded. And I kind of think of the reason why we built the quadratic lands as a meme, it's just a meme right now, but hopefully we'll build it, is that if I corner you at a cocktail party, Carlos, I can tell you why public goods are good. Like, but who wants to know all those economics? Like what people want are memes, and they want to feel viscerally that they're going to be supported and be successful. And so what we're trying to do is like create this vision of a world in which there's serendipity baked into the economic layer, in which like basically you can work on community goods and public infrastructure and be someone who's respected in society because we've rewritten the laws of economic gravity to build that serendipity into our economic systems. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do with the quadratic lands. It's basically, if you go to quadraticlands.com, you will see the experience that we built, which is all about memeing into existence this world, which is neon and vaporwave, and where public goods are funded. There are unicorns in the quadratic lands, and we really want to create a vessel that can take the world to the quadratic lands where public goods like open source software are really well funded, in which the little guy and the little girl has a voice over just like the rich people. And, you know, the message is that we're all in this together. We're all creating this world together. And we want to create this Schelling point in which we can create this world with everyone. And so we are building a vessel to the quadratic lands. We've built Gitcoin, which is basically a company that is trying to fund open source software. And we realized that a company is not the right vessel to get to the quadratic lands. We want to build a DAO, which is a more democratic institution for ushering us into this new world, and a more democratic, a worldwide institution. A company domiciled in the United States is not a good vessel for a global movement. And so we think that a DAO is sort of a better vessel that can serve the community that it serves over the long term. And the Quadratic Lands is what we launched last week in order to usher Gitcoin DAO into the world. So that's basically sort of like the architecture of what I'm going to be doing for the next several years. And basically GTC is the token that represents a governance right in Gitcoin, in which public goods we fund over what circumstances is what you're imbued with the right to do if you hold a GTC token. That was the big release last week. I was supposed to talk to you last week, but then I was like, holy shit, everything's on fire. Can we talk next week? So thank you for accommodating my reschedule. But that's what I've been up to.
It's been great to have this waiting period to learn more, because every day there seems to have been an announcement or a development or just some catching up to do. So I love it. And thank you for reminding me that vaporwave is a word that exists. I always forget about it.
Yeah, totally.
But you spoke about a lot of things, all of them points that I really want to touch on. Got my little list here. But first of all, usually in DAOs, you see that people, well, there's an incentive model, right, for people to participate into the creation of the decentralized governance. And you see that, well, I saw that your proposal actually doesn't give any economic value to the GTC token. You're trying to remove the monetary part from it, which I think is a good way to move further from the whoever pays more or whoever has more money governs the whole infrastructure. So, but how do you plan to incentivize people to collaborate on a DAO using a token that doesn't have a monetary value?
Right. Well, I will say that I think that there was in 2017 there was a sort of this idea that if you take a human and you put a token into it, then you'll get an action. And we learned that that isn't true, right? Because human psychology is more emotional and a lot of times oriented around things that inspire them or emotionally drive them. And one of the things you'll see is that we're really trying to inspire people around this idea that we can build a financial system that's built more around what's good. So I like to think about Yancey Strickler and this idea of bentoism, which is basically not just what's good for now me, but also what's good for future me and for future us and now us as a group of people. And so that's kind of the culture that we're trying to build into Gitcoin DAO. But the decision not to put economic rights into the token was partially driven by that design. But also, I think that we want to make it really clear to anyone who's in Washington that this is not a security. This is a governance token with no economic rights. And so that's part of the reason why this is something that has no economic rights. It's just a governance token. And we're kind of going to start from this place and we're going to see what happens as we evolve over time. But so far, we've got governance of a treasury that's worth $500 million. If you count so there's a little bit of history here, but we've got $5 million worth of ETH in the treasury, and we've got $500 million worth of Akita tokens, which are this dog token that Vitalik donated to Gitcoin DAO. And there's a real question of whether or not the dog tokens are worth $5 or $500 million, but according to Uniswap right now, they're worth $500 million. So there's plenty to govern without having to have economic rights in the platform with just like that amount in the treasury.
All right. And well, we're talking about the incentives, and also one of the main incentives on the DAO's part on what you want to build is that Gitcoin gets eventually completely decentralized and maybe even dissolved, right? One of the possible outcomes that you want to leave out there in the open is to
the company, right?
Yeah, the company.
Yeah,
dissolve the company just to be governed by a DAO.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really up to the community and the DAO to decide what to do here, and we haven't really determined what to do. But right now, we have to decentralize the tech stack in a lot of our operations in order to even really consider it. Because if we shut down the company right now, the whole momentum would stop dead in its tracks. So it's really going to be up to the DAO to decide what to do and on what time frame. But for now, I'm really excited to just be governed by the community that we serve. I have been an entrepreneur for the last 10 or 15 years, and I just remember being a Web2 entrepreneur. You raise some capital and you have these VCs that want you to extract from your users, and I just didn't want to do that again with Gitcoin. I wanted to be governed by the community that I served. And like if you study political philosophy, you'll learn that the consent of the governed is, in a lot of ways, the only legitimate basis of government. And so I'm a big believer that we need to be governed by the community that we're serving. And that's the only way to set up a system that can fund community and public goods. But these Web 2 companies have just basically like they work really hard to attract users, and then they hit a network effect in which they're growing really fast, and then they switch from attracting users to extracting from them. And it's just that's like the Silicon Valley Web 2 playbook. And we're trying to do something different in the DAO space where we're attracting users and hitting that network effect and then just enabling them from there. And that enables future growth and hopefully compounding growth from there. But I don't know. We'll see what happens. I think that we know right now that we want to avoid the Web 2 model, but it's not clear what the Web 3 model is going to be for a successful company. In Web 2, you just build a software as a service business. You charge $10 a month to as many people as possible, and then you eventually exit. And in Web 3, I don't think we've discovered exactly what the model is going to be, but we know it's not the Web 2 Silicon Valley model.
One thing that I've noticed is that every time I have a guest on this podcast and they speak about the Web3, sort of everyone has a different definition of what the Web3 is.
Yeah.
Which have sort of like sparked the joke that the real Web3 is the friends we made along the way. So,
yeah, totally.
So what does the Web3 mean for you?
I would describe Web 1 as from 1995 to maybe 2005. I would describe Web 2 as the technologies from 2005 to 2015. And then Web 3 is whatever grows to prominence from 2015 to, let's call it 2030. And, it's kind of like, like I'm a millennial, but like, is there any definition of what that is? I mean, I guess I grew up with Pokemon, but that was only obvious in hindsight. With Web 2, it seems to me like it was the iPhone and social media that was really ascendant. With Web 3, it seems like it's immutable technology and crypto economics that are going to drive it. But I think the obvious answer will only be it will only be obvious to us in hindsight. With foresight, we're just kind of guessing, and that's why I like to have the time-bound definition of what Web 3 is.
Yeah, I guess it helps to think about it in time spaces rather than in particular
it's
technologies.
An easy out. It's a way of not answering your question.
Yeah, that's also pretty clever. So, but even you see that the only people ever talking about Web3, Web3 this, Web3 that is people in blockchain, right? So you get a feeling that it's a term that sort of been used as a marketing strategy and a bit a selling point for all of us to sort of name what we're trying to do with these big game theory machines that are blockchains.
Well, it's interesting. Juan Benet from Filecoin, Protocol Labs, I think they're called, had a talk called "What is Web3?" and he actually goes into a really thoughtful answer that's better than mine, and talks a little bit about how people thought Web3 was going to be this semantic web in which we had these interconnected XML data structures that had semantic metadata for everything in the world. And it's interesting to know that there was a community that tried to define Web3 before the crypto community, and that didn't really take off, and it's been sort of subsumed by that. But I think that it's not just blockchain technologies, although blockchain technology is playing a part. Like the movement of user data being a liability as much as being an asset is a part of Web3 that has nothing to do with blockchain. Like basically this idea that with GDPR, if you have user data, then you have a liability, not just an asset, has nothing to do with blockchain, but it reflects our evolving norms around the stewardship of data and these technical systems during the 2015 to 2030 era. But I think it's useful to note that it's not just blockchains. You can maybe hear my son in the background there.
A bit, yeah. Man, you also, now that you mentioned the GDPR, I remember something you said before about public goods and about privacy being sort of a public good. So would you like to expand or to lay down your definition of public goods? Because I think it would be really interesting coming from you that work full-time in funding public goods.
Totally. Yeah, so public goods are basically a type of good that is non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So as opposed to like a pen drive that you could get on Amazon, which is basically like something you pay $20 for and it gets shipped to your house. A public good like open source software, because it's available for free online, is non-excludable, which means I can't stop someone from consuming it, and non-rivalrous, which basically means that if Carlos and all of his listeners are going to download that repository, doesn't prevent me from downloading it, as opposed to a pen drive. Like if you buy the last pen drive, I can't get it. And so one of the sort of really hard problems with public goods is that they derive 80 or 90% of the value in the world, in my opinion. And And like what good, every time I started a new web startup, I use open source software, and that comprises 90% of my tech stack. But also, what good is having a Lamborghini if you have lung cancer because you didn't have clean air? Or like there's no transportation network for you to get from A to B. And so basically public goods are good, but there's no way of funding them with markets. And that's one of the sort of ironies of being an entrepreneur is that it's hard to build something that gets really big without a business model that supports public goods. So that's kind of what we're trying to change with the blockchain space.
And yeah, like in this space, the deeper you look into things and the deeper you strive away from the price discussion, from coin discussion, everything, the more you realize that the real usage of blockchains or the real innovation happens when they're used to challenge this conventional wisdom, right? This wisdom of this should be done like this, it should be like that. You cannot do this because you risk people doing this and that. And well, that just lands us right there in the topic of collusion, right? Which is like the main thing you're trying to fight right now. Am I correct to assume that you guys didn't have much collusion problems when you were first starting with the Gitcoin grants program?
Yeah, totally. So quadratic funding sort of relies on Sybil resistance, which is digital identity that verifies that you're a unique human. Like if you can make up 10 new identities instead of giving $10 to that second grant and give it under 10 different identities, then it breaks the foundation of quadratic funding. So Sybil resistance is the base layer. But collusion resistance is basically like, if I were to offer all of Carlos's listeners $1 kickback for contributing $1 to my Gitcoin grant, then that breaks the psychology and the game theory of quadratic funding. And so collusion resistance and Sybil resistance is an ongoing research problem in the space. And one of the cool things about Gitcoin is that quadratic funding is not just a theory anymore. It's actually something that we're putting into practice on Gitcoin grants. And so we can actually test different Sybil resistance and collusion resistance techniques. And basically the idea is that it's like an impedance function. When we had $25,000 in the matching pool, who really gives a crap enough to collusion attack it? But now that we're moving $2 million per quarter, there's actually an incentive for attackers to try to attack the system. And so we're kind of in this cat and mouse game where every single round, and we run around every quarter, we try to get better at detecting Sybil resistance and collusion, and the attackers try to get better at attacking us. And so it's actually this giant red team, blue team exercise in which we're basically running an experiment. We're seeing how the bad guys attack it. We're going back to governance and saying, this is how we think we should remediate. And then we're iterating forward together. It's almost like like an adversarial neural network kind of situation. So it's an unsolved research problem is the TLDR, and we actually have data in order to test out hypotheses. And that's part of the fun of what we're doing with Gitcoin.
I think it was Vitalik in himself that specified that some of the ways to fight, well, and this is like just a more basic concept here, but he really drove it across in this blog post, that the most important way to fight these kind of collusion acts is to make it too expensive for the attacker to try and attack the network, right? So there are lots of strategies that you're trying to put into place, one of them being identity verification. But have you noticed any threshold, any point upon which things seem to start working? Or is that something you'd rather not talk about because then that's where people get colluding?
Yeah, this is actually a principle in all crypto economics, is that if a system is cheaper to defend than it is to attack, then it's more anti-fragile. And I'll just say that I learned this from Vitalik listening to a podcast of his about proof of stake, which is basically you got to design the system so that it's much more economical for the attackers to just defend the system instead of to attack it. And that's the core principle of crypto economics and really any economic game. Like if you think about misinformation in the world, one of the reasons it's such a hard problem in social media is that a rumor can go a mile before the truth even has a chance to get off the starting line. And so that's one of the real problems with misinformation in the world today, and sort of framed in that attack defend type analogy. We are actually trying really hard to educate people about how Sybil attacks work, because the anti-fragile decentralized way of countering a Sybil attack is that if the everyday participant is informed about what they look like and can report them to the governing body of Gitcoin. And so we've faced a choice of like, okay, well, if we just basically like hide the information about what a Sybil or collusion attack looks like, then basically only the informed bad guys are going to know how to use it. Where if we democratize the information about what a Sybil or collusion attack looks like, then we become more anti-fragile and less dependent on a central body to find them and to root them out, which is more in line with Gitcoin's ethos. So that's one way of countering Sybil attacks. Another is identity verification, as you noted. And then Vitalik has this proposal around pairwise bonding of contributions. And that's a way of stopping collusion attacks. It's basically like if you have, well, it's probably too complicated to explain what pairwise bonding is. Your listeners can look it up if they want to. There are ways of solving or at least dampening collusion, and that's what we're trying to do as we scale. Basically, the key metric is the fraud tax of Gitcoin grants. How much of the matching pool is misallocated due to fraud every quarter? And right now, we did 33K, we think, was misallocated in Gitcoin grants, around 9 out of 1.8 million, which is like 1.5% of the entire experiment. So it's just about keeping that number down.
I didn't read this report yet. I try to look into what happens after every grant round, but I'm not too sure that I know where did this 1.5% went that was not supposed to go there. Right. So what was it that was funded incorrectly?
Totally. So one of the things that we decided to do in the governance process was to not name any grants that would have benefited from it, because there's a difference between basically, like, we don't have any smoking gun that says that the grants participated in this. Like, it could have just been a false flag by the attackers to make it look like a certain grant was a bad guy when really the grant owner had nothing to do with it. And so we made the decision not to talk about which grants benefited from the collusion, because we didn't want the community to basically make any assumptions. So okay. We're not talking about it at this time, but that may change in future grants rounds.
Okay, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And now that you have all these data, and there's another very interesting problem that you guys are constantly working on, that is the fact that grants for some public goods that take a long time to develop need to be sort of like an ongoing thing, right? Like if a project keeps delivering the results, they should continue to get funded in order to have some predictability to continue to develop. So how do you strive to make this happen?
Totally. Well, I have empathy for the problem, first off, let me say. And by the way, I'm coming at you straight from my house, which is under a mortgage, and I have to make my mortgage payment every month. So I have empathy for that. I think I also panned around and you maybe saw the unicorn that I have right here. I did see the
unicorn. Beautiful.
proves that I am a true Etherean. Basically, so we actually, it's actually kind of a funny story, because we pioneered, along with other community members, EIP 1337, which is the lead standard for recurring payments on the blockchain. And basically the idea was, what if we made Gitcoin grants a subscription site where you could pay $10 a month to your favorite open source maintainer? Well, we launched with that, and it turns out no one gave crap about recurring payments. And we pivoted to quadratic funding as the basis of Gitcoin grants. And the reason that we did that was that people just seem to not really care about doing recurring payments. And they really seem to care about the matching multiple with quadratic funding. And so that was sort of lesson number one. But lesson number two was that if we run the Gitcoin grants rounds every quarter, and we basically set the social norm in the community that they're going to happen every 2 or 3 months, then the community can adjust their behavior on the assumption that if they contribute to the public good, then they're going to be taken care of by their peers. And there's also a built-in accountability mechanism where if you don't deliver over a 3-month period, then people aren't going to fund your grant in 3 months. And so it's that cadence of every 3 months having a crowdfunding campaign that you know that you can rely on that is what we're aiming for right now. And so far, it's been default opt back in that a consumer has to choose to contribute to you every quarter, as opposed to a subscription, which is just charged to your credit card every single time interval. And so far, that's been the sort of magic way of doing it, but we'll see how it evolves over time. I would personally really like it if people were excited about not just funding projects for 1 quarter, but for 5 quarters out, like you can automatically recontribute to quadratic funding. So we'll see how it evolves, but that's at least the cadence that we've fallen in from here. But as someone who owns a home and like has a mortgage to pay, I'm definitely empathetic to the fact that people want monthly rewards and continual rewards as opposed to just a one-time payout.
And yeah, I mean, we all work better and perform better when we are under the feeling that we have moving space, right? Like people are more creative when they're not completely under pressure.
Totally.
I see now that they're fully employed. Are there any fully employed people by by Gitcoin bounties and by Gitcoin grants, or is it just the projects that get funded so far? Because I see that some people have raised significant numbers, like collaborating with bounties, but I don't know if anyone's working just full time in that.
Totally. Yeah, Vitalik has this idea of a quadratic freelancer, which is just someone who's funded primarily by quadratic subsidies and just works for the open internet. And I think that's a really interesting idea. I think the reality is a little bit more messy in that a lot of people involved in the space hold ETH. They also work for Gitcoin grants and bounties. And then they're like multi-tenanting across like Dev Protocol and Radical and all these other earning mechanisms. They go to ETH Global hackathons and win hackathons. So I'm super proud of the alumni that Gitcoin Grants has. Like we were through the bear market, we were kind of like, we tried to be the pilot light that kept the ecosystem afloat. And, you know, I would never take credit for their success, but I think we partially helped fund like 1inch Exchange and Uniswap and Urine Finance through the bear market. And now those are some of the most household names in the DeFi space. And so you know, obviously they're the architects of their own success, but we played a small part in making sure that a lot of these projects could survive the bear market, and we're at least partially funded in the bear market. And I really hope that in the next cycle we can play an even bigger part in many projects. But yeah, it's a really exciting time to go to DevCon and have tens of people come up to me and say, "Hey, Gitcoin Grants helped me through a hard time." It feels really good.
And it must feel even better to see some things come full circle, right? Like Uniswap now being part of the people pitching into the fund or putting money into the fund that then matches people's contributions.
Totally. Yeah, it's you know, as they say out here in Colorado, karma is a circle, and it's definitely true.
And yeah, and even SushiSwap, now that it like they're derived from Uniswap. Well, you're very much a true Ethereum. I mean, you have a unicorn in your backyard, and you're very much active in the Ethereum space. But of course, it's important when we talk about public goods that we also cover other blockchains or acknowledge that there are other blockchains that are also public goods, that are also going to host a lot of public goods. So what are your thoughts on other blockchains that are other protocols that are around that are sort of advertised as Ethereum killers?
Totally. Well, one nice thing about launching governance is that no one has to care what I think. Like it's up to the stewards who we integrate with. But historically, when Gitcoin was a company, we did grant rounds with Zcash. We've integrated with Bitcoin. We've integrated with Celo, Zilliqa, Polkadot, Ethereum Classic. Oh man, I'm forgetting. There's like 12 different chains that we've integrated with. And so, you know, how integrated we are into their social fabric is really up to the Gitcoin stewards and also those communities themselves. But I am an open source maximalist, not an Ethereum maximalist. Ethereum is just a great place to get a start because there's a critical mass of developers and funding that's available in the Ethereum space. But once that network effect reaches escape velocity, I think that there's a real opportunity to fund public goods elsewhere. And I'm just going to really quickly shill to you that we're launching fundoss.org next week. And that's a way of funding traditional open source software. Think like NPM and the Python ecosystem, stuff like that. And I'm really excited to be taking quadratic funding, which we sort of pioneered in the blockchain space, and bringing it back into the mainstream with FundOSS. TLDR, I'm an open source maximalist, not an Ethereum maximalist. Well, I'm both, but I'm primarily an open source maximalist.
Right. So you kind of gave us your true opinion in the in the finish, in the last sentence. It's great. But yeah, I really like, I use open source software a lot. I try to use open source as much as I can. Like we edit these videos on Audacity with all kinds of open source software whenever possible. What are some initiatives that you're that you would like to get get funded through these kind of grants, both in the blockchain space and in the traditional space?
Totally. I ran a podcast for 50 episodes and I used a lot of Audacity. I think it's a really great product. One of the things that I think is interesting is that even if your listeners don't know they're using open source software, if they hit any website across the world, there's like something like a 70% chance that they're using some flavor of Linux or Postgres or MySQL or all these different technologies. And so whether or not you know it, you're using open source software. And one of the things that I'm just really excited about is on the systemic level, making sure that open source has a business model, because then there will be a more sound digital infrastructure. And one of the canonical examples of open source not being well financially supported is OpenSSL Labs. Back in 2015, there was a hack of OpenSSL called the Heartbleed bug. And OpenSSL is used on something like 95% of the web servers across the world as an encryption library. And the crazy thing is that the OpenSSL Foundation was running on less than $1 million per year of donations, despite the fact that it was used on 95% of websites. Like the little lock in the top left of your web browser that shows that you're secured is OpenSSL. And so I think that that's a great example of a project that just didn't have the funding that it needed to support the amount of value that it creates in the world. And so encryption and privacy is sort of my go-to example of something that I want to see well funded in the traditional open source ecosystem. But in Ethereum, I think the point is even accelerated because we all have these bags, like all these crypto tokens of these shitcoins, and like they're all sitting on top of they're standing on the shoulders of giants, insofar as they are supported by open source software. I actually photoshopped, there's an XKCD comic about this, about how basically open source software is built on this totally brittle infrastructure. And I actually photoshopped it to make a Web3 version of it, just to show your listeners. So your bags are all built on top of open source software, none of which actually derives any of the value of the DeFi ecosystem that's built on top of it. So it's really important to make sure that this infrastructure that your bags are sitting upon is well funded, so that there's no black swan events that cause you to get hacked or whatever.
And speaking about cheat coins, and speaking about cheat coins sitting on top of great protocols that have been open source, and like Ethereum itself sometimes struggles for funding, and you see how unequal the funding for even for Bitcoin Core is, just when compared to the masses, to the ridiculous numbers that get moved around in these protocols. There is a side of fighting collusion that I'm very interested in and that is preventing projects from having tokens, because that somehow would incentivize people to fund projects that can have coins that can moon at some point, and that can leave out good projects that are open source and that fund and that cover a real need, a real world need. So how do you think about this? Because obviously you cannot censor projects and tell them, do not do this, do not do that.
That's a really great question. To accentuate the point of what you're talking about, I'm actually going to pull up my screen share again and just show you this graph that Vitalik published, showing the proof of work spending budget for the Ethereum and Bitcoin networks, which is $15 billion per year, and the R&D budget, which is like $0.1 billion per year in each of these networks. And I just think it's really crazy to see, because we can measure and manage proof of work, then we can actually allocate money to it. But with R&D, it's a little bit less, it's less provable. Like you have proof of work in the blockchain networks, but you don't have proof of knowledge work when it comes to R&D. And therefore you can't prove that those funds aren't being spent in a fraudulent way. And therefore, as a result, we just don't have a deployment mechanism to knowledge work that's as provable as proof of work. And so my approach to this is basically to recognize that there's a spectrum of purity in terms of public
I'm really impressed with the speed that you come up with these things.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think about this kind of stuff a lot. So,
no, but the pictures, like you just have them like right on the fly. That's awesome.
Yeah, totally. Well, we're trying to create cultural change. So basically, like my attitude is that there's like a spectrum of reasons why you would contribute to these projects that is on the right-hand side, less pure, and then on the left-hand side, which is more pure. And on the left-hand side, it's contributing out of an altruistic regard for the community. And on the right-hand side, it's contributing to get formal compensation like tokens or access to services and stuff. And so my attitude with Gitcoin, and I, by the way, like I'm a total pragmatist. I think that all of these things are subject to network effects and momentum. And so basically, if we can create network effects and momentum around contributing to public goods across this funnel, then the momentum is going to bleed from the less pure side of things into the more pure side of things, just by the sheer social escape velocity that we're going to hit with these things. And especially if it only has to be $1 to show that you care about a project, it's Gitcoin's job to basically pull people down that funnel and use our like brand momentum and like shiny vaporwave objects in order to pull people down that spectrum. And so that's how I think that we're gonna solve that problem, and also having more verifiable mechanisms to show what has value to people. The amazing thing about quadratic funding is that we actually have a preference map of the entire Ethereum community to know what they care about. And just to accentuate that point, I've got this little this little map that we've been building of the Gitcoin grants contributions round over round. And this is round 9, the most recent round that we ran, that had 170K contributions worth $2 million. And if I just sort of show you that in this preference map, each node is a project or a user, and each edge is a contribution from them, we have this really dense map of what the community actually cares about in the Ethereum ecosystem. It's a mesh network of jobs. It's a mesh network of preferences. And so we have a more verifiable way of measuring what the community cares about by running these quadratic funding experiments, which if I go back to the example of Vitalik's blog, which is proof of work versus proof of knowledge work, there's a big discrepancy there. So if we can solve that problem, we can pull people down the funnel. So I don't know. I think that the one thing that we know for sure is that we're not going to fund public goods with taxation in the internet economy like we did in the nation state industrial economy. And so it's about pioneering new models for funding public goods, I think.
I'm curious now, what were your conclusions for doing these maps? What have you found that the Ethereum community cares about?
Well, they definitely care about projects that are building the foundation of their infrastructure. So like an ETH2 client has always done really well round over round. There's a certain number of builders out there like Austin Griffith that has done pretty well in quadratic funding. And that's really amazing because Austin's a friend of mine. And I think that he builds a lot of prototypes like ETH build and oh man, it's escaping me his most recent project, but basically builders that are just building for the public good, seeing them even at the app layer supported is one of my most favorite things. But I'm really most proud of the alumni like Uniswap and Urine and 1inch Exchange, because they've gone on to be billion-dollar projects and have just proven that we have it. Like basically we have an edge. Like if you start off by funding the projects that your peers respect, as opposed to some central grant administrator, not only does that push power to the edges, but it also becomes like an information filter for the rest of the ecosystem to see what's up and coming. Because you're basically, it's like a giant data gathering experiment for what's going to take off next. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And I hope to continue to see projects that are alumni of Gitcoin grants go off to do great things in the world. I think that to me is the most systemically important thing that we could be doing, is basically being a DAO of DAOs, basically a DAO that helps accelerate projects when they're pre-seed or seed funded, and helps them go off into the world and become what they can be. It's like building a mechanism that accelerates human potential. And I just hope that we can be that at scale for the rest of the world, and not just for this little crypto niche, which is beautiful, but it's also very small.
And just to add to your point of this pragmatic view of like the not so nice side of the spectrum funding the nicer side of the spectrum, in the conversation we have, you can find it in this channel for everyone listening, with Pete Wood from Coinburp, we were talking about the NFT bubble back in that moment where it was at its highest peak, and that was his take on it as well, that of course a lot of stupidity was being funded through NFTs or with NFTs or for NFTs, but in the end of the day, the money that gets allocated to that finds its way back to the things that matter and that people actually want in the community.
Yeah, it's definitely an optimistic take. I think a lot of money was just wasted, just like in the ICO bubble. But a lot of money was wasted in the internet boom in the 90s also. And I'm 35. I don't know how many of your listeners are millennials versus Gen Z people, but the internet gave us Amazon, and it gave us Google, and it gave us a lot of innovation. But a lot of capital was wasted to get there, and I think you just got to take that long arc on the view of things.
And I think as well that, well, yeah, just what you said, like we waste money on a lot of things, and somehow like this little bit that gets sent to innovative ideas, that's where the innovation comes from, right? From making the most out of what little gets sent there. Are there any, because the graph you showed before, it really tells a lot of where we currently are, right? Just seeing how thin the development of our protocols are. Are there any proposals that aim to fund the things such as Ethereum Foundation or Gitcoin itself? Do you have trouble getting funding for Gitcoin itself?
Well, during the bear market, we almost didn't survive. And I actually don't know if a lot of people know that. That could be like your breaking headline of this episode. Like, Gitcoin almost didn't survive the bear market, but now look at it, it's a DAO. And
this is definitely going to be one of the 2-minute clips. Shout out to everyone watching this in a 2-minute clip.
Yeah, exactly. So we almost didn't survive the bear market. And I think a part of the reason for was like, Kevin, this is this hippy dippy public goods thing, but like, what's your business model? And so what we actually ended up doing was we have Gitcoin grants, which is one of the reasons why people care about Gitcoin funding public goods. And we actually launched this whole hackathon business unit, which is basically like taking the brand halo and the developers that come onto Gitcoin for Gitcoin grants, and then basically running virtual hackathons and basically keeping Gitcoin afloat by funding Gitcoin grants, subsidizing Gitcoin grants using hackathons, and that allowed us to show revenue growth to our investors. And like one of the nice things about hackathons is that a purchasing department, like a VP of marketing, knows how to sponsor a hackathon for like $7,000. Like that's just something that everyone in the space does, and we just kind of fell ass backwards onto developers, which everyone in the space cares about marketing to developers. And so we've kind of built like a marketing business off of the back of like the altruism and Gitcoin grants business. And that's how we survived the bear market. I think that these markets are going to move between fear and greed. And in the greed times, you need to really become what you want to become, which is, for us, it's like funding public goods. But in the bear market, you have to have that raw political, just like ground game in order to be able to survive. And it's the oscillation of the two in which innovation happens. And so that was our strategy for getting through the last bear market. We just raised a bunch of money from Paradigm, and we're really happy to have them on the cap table now. And hopefully we can survive the next market cycle and become our final form, which is a DAO of DAO that funds public goods. So that's been my experience. I don't know what the generalizable principle is, but hopefully if Gitcoin can solve for public goods funding for the rest of the ecosystem, then other people aren't going to have that problem during the bear market. They can just raise from their communities using Gitcoin grants.
And well, there is a lot coming on in Ethereum in particular, right? There is the London fork that's coming on. There's Ethereum 2.0 coming on. Do you think that this can do something to extend this positive market cycle a bit more, this bullish market? How do you think the rollout of these things is gonna look for people in the space?
Well, I'm excited about EIP 1559 because it makes gas prices more efficient to estimate. I'm excited about ETH2 because it'll make Ethereum more environmentally friendly, and also like the promised vision of ETH2 is to make transactions as cheap as air. And I'm really excited about that because there's just a whole new set of social networks and web systems that you can build when microtransactions are cheap. And just the design space of like right now, transactions are kind of expensive, but it's actually really interesting to think about. We go from transactions having, I don't know, costing $5 or whatever to costing like a fifth of a cent. And just to give you an idea of that, like I've seen that world because on Gitcoin grants, we integrated a layer 2 technology onto Gitcoin grants. And we went from, wow, transactions are so expensive, it stinks to use Gitcoin grants, to, holy crap, transaction spam is a problem on Gitcoin grants because it's so cheap to like spam people with transactions. And I just think that that's really incredible to think about because, wow, it's just like we shifted the pendulum from one side to another, and now we have to worry about transaction spam because it's so cheap. And I think that's the world that we're moving towards. I'm really excited about inventing a social network that optimizes for what are people willing to pay 30 cents for because they value that content, as opposed to likes. You know, think about it, like likes and hearts are just like the ultimate shitcoin. They have an infinite supply. They're not scarce at all. And so like, what would Twitter look like if you could tip someone 20 cents instead of just liking their post? Like people could just live off of shit posting on Twitter. And we actually ran an experiment with this on Gitcoin. We changed the default like feedback mechanism from a like to a micro tip. So like 20 cents. And then we ran a mini quadratic funding round in the Gitcoin news feed over like every week. We would give out $200 to people who were just shit posting on Gitcoin. And one of the things that we saw is that it really shifted the behavior that the network optimized for, from like, you know, what elicits a dopamine reaction in my head and therefore I'll like it, versus like, oh, what actually has value to me and I'm willing to spend 30 cents on this. And it's really interesting to think about a social network that optimizes for what people actually value, as opposed to just like what triggers that dopamine rush in their head. And so that's just one example of what's going to be able to be possible once ETH2 goes live. And I'm here for it. Like I'm all about inventing the web to move away from advertising models into fund creators. And so I think that that's what we're going to move towards, and I'm pumped for it.
Actually, this came from one of the blog posts in Vitalik's blog that you were showing before. Advertising could actually be considered a public good that takes away value instead of contributing value, right? It's something that makes the world worse for everyone just because someone gets to purchase it. So yeah, these type of models that you're mentioning, they're almost the exact opposite of what Reddit did with its cryptocurrency subreddit, just giving away coins to everyone that would receive a like, which just caused the behavior of the subreddit to get totally engineered for cheat posting and low quality stuff, virtue signaling, etc. Do you think do you have any thoughts about these kind of models for social media in the current marketplace?
My first principles sort of thinking is that we have programmable money, observably, empirically. We value public goods. We value value creation is point number 2. And so assembling these thoughts, what if we could build a monetary system that funds public goods? And so basically we can program our values into our money and build systems that fund what we actually value, as opposed to just like what allows us to capture value. So that's the exciting space for me. And then I also think about I think a lot about how the internet of value is similar to the internet of information. The internet of information changed the way society was architected by allowing information to go across the computer network and without an intermediary. And so now everyone on the internet has the distribution of the New York Times. And we reinvented newspapers, entertainment, media, politics, everything that relies on information. And now we have the internet of value, and we can send value across the computer network. And the allegory is, well, we could reinvent everything that relies on value transfer in society. So finance, investment, speculation, insurance, jobs. I don't think anyone's focused on jobs right now, and they absolutely should be, because if we want to go mainstream, 95% of the world's financial lives is their jobs, not their investments. And so you got to focus on what they need to do in order to reprogram society. And we could rewrite the rules of economic gravity to focus more on labor as opposed to just capital using the blockchain systems. But we basically have to decide that we want to do it. And the great opportunity is that we're reinventing the value transfer layer of society over the next 20 years. And just to drive home the point of how different it's going to be, when was the last time you sent a postcard, Carlos, or a mail, a snail mail or something like that?
I sent you a screenshot of a podcast of a postcard before a trade, but yeah,
that was yours. A digital one though, physical, like a letter to someone. When was the last time you sent one of those?
I don't think I've ever.
Yeah. So basically, before the internet, you would send a letter or a postcard to someone. But now post internet, we probably send 100 messages per day over email or IM or Twitter, like you and I were tweeting at each other or something earlier. And so now there's a 100x usage of information because we've just made it so much more efficient to exchange information with the internet. Well, what's the allegory with the internet of value? Like, like in 10 years, once we've reinvented the social and value layer of society, are you and I going to be like microtipping each other because we did this podcast together, or like sending each other NFTs, just like a casual like shitpost NFT, similar to how we send IMs to each other today? And so there's an increase in frequency that comes from the more efficient value transfer layer. And I just think that it's only going to be so I'm actually coming to answer your question now, which is like, it's only going to be obvious in hindsight how we're going to reinvent this stuff, because, like who in 1992 could have predicted like instant messaging and Twitter and Facebook and stuff? You didn't have any way of like grokking it in your head. And it's the same with the blockchain space. Like in 2035, we're going to look back and we're going to say, oh, like quadratic funding was totally obvious, but looking forward, it's really hard to grok because you just don't have a schema for it in your mind. And so that's a long way of not answering your question, but maybe giving you some constructions to think about it, about answering the question yourself.
No, that's a lot of great ways to look at these things. Like the more efficient the networks get, the better we get at subtracting the intrinsic value of the thing that we're trying to do, right? So like in social media, like you said before, is trying to give each other a little like serotonin spike. So maybe you find a better way to do that, not necessarily by paying them for a like. So Kevin, man, it's been really fun to have this conversation with you. It's been great to have you here. It's been great to see your kids running around in the background and everything. So it's is there anything else you'd like to say to our audience? Is there anything that you'd like people listening to this to do to continue to explore Quadratic Lands on Gitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, my challenge to people is let's build a better financial system. Let's not just build a decentralized casino. I think that we've got degen finance, we've got DeFi, and now we want to build regen finance. We want to build a financial system that's a better substrate for the world's value transfer and that rewards people who are actually creating value, not just intermediaries. And so I want people to meme for the public good. Public goods are good, and we're starting to do it on Gitcoin. And so memeing for the public good instead of just memeing for the lulz is my call to action to your audience. And you can find me on Twitter, memeing for the public good at twitter.com/OWOCKI, OWOCKI. And if you Google Gitcoin, I think we've finally reached the level of legitimacy where Google does not autocorrect Gitcoin to Bitcoin. So if you Google Gitcoin, you can find me there as well. Thanks so much for having me, Carlos.
Go on Gitcoin. And well, we'll be memeing for the public good as well. And so should you listening to this. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.